Hello, and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're talking about dungeons, we're talking about dragons, we're talking about books about dungeons, and then let's throw in a dragon. We're talking about the first book of the Forgotten Realms. Let me start that again. I hated that intro. Hello, welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. If you are geeky in any way, you've probably played Dungeons and Dragons at least once in your life. Have you read, though, any of the Dungeons and Dragons books? Like with Star Wars, there was a whole series of books written in the 80s and 90s, and especially in the 2000s. And I think some of them are still coming out. I hadn't really touched them until Paul Christopher Hoppy, the Zen madman, the giant Buddha, the person who has been a part of this podcast in one way or another since the very beginning, pointed out to me that there are some pretty good books that are part of those series and had me start reading about a character named Driz. And we're talking today about a book called The Crystal Shard. It is book one of the Icewind Dale trilogy, which is also the book that kind of kicked off The Legend of Driz, a series of 40 novels, I think, something like that. Like a lot of books.
A lot.
Yeah, that were written about
A lot.
Forgotten Realms. And if you haven't read these books, don't worry about it. We're going to be talking about what happens in the book, but also we're going to be talking about what are the general themes and sort of how this book hits and how it is aged and just why it was a book that was important to Paul when Paul read it and why it's something that hits me today. So with all that, Paul, say hello and talk a little bit about how you first encountered this book.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about The Crystal Shard, which is R.A. Salvatore's first book. I'm not positive whether it's Salvatore or Salvatore. I think in my head I always said Salvatore, but now I think probably being in like Massachusetts or whatever, it's probably Salvatore. So that's what I'm going to say today. Apologies to Bob if that's wrong. Which I believe is actually what he goes by, what his friends call, So this is the first book. This is, I believe, his debut novel. It's the first book in the, in his Forgotten Realms series. The first trilogy, the Icewind Dale trilogy. It's not the first one I read. I actually, I think I read The Hobbit first, but I'm not positive. I think I read The Hobbit when I was like 12. And then I think I got these books like similar time. But I got the second and third books, Streams of Silver, and The Halfling's Gem.
Right.
And which are the second and third books in the trilogy. And so I read the second book, and I'm not going to talk about the plot, but just the Hobbit was probably the thing that kind of got me like into fantasy, which is kind of appropriate since it kind of got fantasy into existence in a way, right?
And certainly not just fantasy, but also a lot of the concepts that we think of as just kind of essential to Dungeons and Dragons, the idea of dwarves as like miners and often like fighters, of the existence of characters like hobbits or halflings, a lot of the ideas of like the different kinds of people can be, there's a lot of like the origins of the Hobbit you can see in the first D&D books.
Yeah, and similarly, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings draw from mythology, right? So it's not like pulling it forth from the ether, but that kind of got things to kind of coalesce into like what became a spawning genre,
right?
And I would say that Streams of Silver, though, the way it was written, it's very different from The Hobbit, but it's also very similar to The Hobbit, which we'll talk about perhaps next time. But it really, along with then the rest of the books in the series, kind of spawned my love for writing as much as just fantasy and reading fiction, where I had played role-playing games. I actually hadn't really played much before reading these books. I played like there were the computer games, although maybe that was a little bit after. And I had like the red box set for Dungeons and Dragons, but I didn't really play with people much until like high school. And then when I did, I actually never really loved role-playing games that much in terms of playing the games. Like sometimes I did, and I played a lot of them, but I always kind of felt like, one of the great things about role-playing games is that it's this collaborative storytelling, really, right? Which other games later like really kind of put a point on that nail, right? But that's also sort of one of the drawbacks. If you have like an idea of, you make a character and you have an idea kind of what you want this character to do, and then that doesn't really fit with the story, and you have a certain amount of agency, but it's like it's a little bit more like life than it is like telling a story. And so the thing that I really enjoy about the books, or that kind of I enjoyed, was it felt like this world, this setting that I really enjoyed, with all this imagination, that it felt a little more coherent to me than what often came out of actual games,
Right.
And there's this momentum, and the stories move in a way that I think sometimes, a campaign can kind of drag at points. That's not to say that like I haven't enjoyed role-playing games and had times when it was like great,
Right.
but just there've been, along the way, there's like a lot of disappointments. And I found myself one morning just like ripping out like 10 pages of not literally ripping them from a book. I mean, like typing,
ripping them out of your brain.
Exactly. Shortly after I'd gotten like my first computer, and somehow I didn't keep going with that. That kind of was just like a spurt. And then I did other writing later, but I don't know. To me, it feels like, a world of imagination where kind of not literally anything's possible, but just there's a wide scope of potential stories, really.
Yeah.
And this book, The Crystal Shard, is a little bit more local, and some of the other ones are more kind of expansive and far-reaching.
Right.
And I enjoy both.
Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying, and we're gonna get to the book, I promise. But this is
Yeah.
pretty much what the conversation will be about to begin with, about like role playing and books and how this all fits in, because I think I liked role playing a lot for a lot of the same reasons. Like, yes, it's fun to roll dice and to see what happens, but some of my favorite role playing sessions as both a player and as a dungeon master or story master are the ones where I'm never rolling dice, where it is about, and I've always come to think of role playing games as kind of. Sorry. I've come to think of role-playing games as community storytelling. That sort of one person is like guiding the story, and then you're sort of an improv troupe with other people yes-anding and filling in. And games go best when it is a lot of yes and not very well when it's a lot of no but. But sometimes that can work as well. And it's funny because on TikTok recently, there's been this big debate over how do people play D&D and what's the right way to play D&D.
Right way.
Well, exactly. And some folks were saying, like, some person like mentioned that as the dungeon master, sometimes they'll fudge the hit point totals of their, the enemies, or like they'll fudge a roll for the point of the narrative, where it's like actually killing this person this easy does not really make sense, or like the goblin getting a nat 20 twice and doing incredible damage isn't what this is supposed to happen in the story beat. And a lot of people pushed back really hard against that. Like, no, but the rules are you're supposed to follow the rules and the roles and stuff like that. And I'm not saying that one side or the other is wrong in that. I think for me, it's really about what kind of thing are you trying to do. I think Dungeons and Dragons especially, but a lot of other games, it has the potential to be basically a medieval fantasy war game that you can play.
I mean, it more or less originated that way, I think.
Yeah. And especially now with miniatures and the way that the maps are done and stuff like that, you can do some really great, very intense wargaming with a lot of RPG, role-playing thrown in. Or you can lean more on the role-playing side, or you're going to be somewhere in the middle. And I'm just a big believer in, like, you do what you want to do. And you tell the kind of story that you want to tell with that group. And a lot of people now talk about the session 0 session being really important. We just get everyone on the same page. And like, what are you trying to do? What do we want to have? Do we want to have all of us backstabbing against each other? Or do we want to all be one happy, shiny party or something like that? If you want the backstabbing, Vampire the Masquerade is right down the road. It's great for it. If you want one happy, shiny party, Vampire the Masquerade, not the one to do. That was the main game Paul and I played quite a lot when we were in high school, so that's why I'm bringing that one up. But yeah, and so I think part of why I resisted these books for a while, I'd seen them, was it always felt to me like, well, the whole point is for me to create my own place in the world. Why would I want to read what someone else has done? And then what I started realizing more and more is that I like that I think a lot of the problems I had with role-playing games were that it's imagination. And if what you're imagining and what I'm imagining are fundamentally different, that's hard for us to role-play in the same way. And a game like Vampire or some of the other games that are set in modern day, it's easy to be like, okay, well, we both know what the streets of New York are like. And so we can kind of imagine if it's a little darker, a little grittier. What's your vision of a medieval town? And what's my vision of a medieval town? If they don't match up, like, we're going to have some problems. And as I was reading this book, I think part of what got me reading this book, honestly, was you haven't played the video game Baldur's Gate, have you?
No, I mean the very old one. I played the like early AD&D games, but kind of up to and then not including Baldur's Gate. But I've like seen some gameplay, but no, I haven't like played it.
Yeah, I mean years and years ago when we were kids, like Pool of Radiance and all that. That was a whole series. Baldur's Gate 3 is the one that not recently. It's probably like 2 or 3 years older than I know, but it really kind of changed the game in terms of like narrative storytelling, and it's just. It's kind of fun because like now I'm about to start a D&D campaign, and if I just say like we're in this area that's near Waterdeep, people know what that is, and people have an idea of like how these things fit together. And yeah, so I think it was with that spirit that I was happy to approach the book, and I was pretty happily surprised with the nature of the storytelling, the nature of the characters. Some parts I think that you know, and just where the story winds up taking us.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I fully agree that like there's no like this is the right way to game, right?
Right.
Like the thing about role-playing games and really any kind of group gaming is I do feel like everybody has to be on the same page to an extent, you know?
Yeah.
And when it comes to kind of fudging dice rolls and this or that or whatever, you know, I don't have any like really inherent issue with that. But I do think it can go along with something I always had a huge issue with. And these were the games that I was just like, yeah, I don't want to play in this game. Which is like DM or like storyteller railroading.
Yes.
Basically 100%. Like this is going to be the story. This is what has to happen. No, you know, if it's like, well, this character wasn't supposed to die here and it's like an NPC or whatever. And it's like, well, or like you have to do this or like, you know, there's something that the storyteller, whatever, like is like, this is what's going to happen. And then the players like come up with some brilliant idea to like prevent it from happening. And then like, no, but it has to happen. It's like, no, like you have to recognize that like genius has occurred. You know what I mean? Like that. And sometimes, I mean, I've experienced the opposite of railroading where there was like, I was in this one thing, I think it was Earth Dawn, but it was like, there was all these riddles and we like were trapped in a place and just had to solve the riddle. Yeah. And so literally there's like 6 of us sitting in around a room trying to solve a riddle for like just hours on end. And it was kind of boring. Yeah. But it was also like, that was the story. And it's sort of like railroading, but the opposite of railroading. Right. Like it wasn't like you're going to solve the riddle. It's like you have to, but like, the storyteller wasn't going to like do it for us. And, and kind of backstabbing things. I think I do agree. Like, I think for the most part, like having people on the same page about like, okay, is this just going to be kind of like a I've been like watching a lot of mysteries and I used to read some and, there's 2 main categories. There's cozies and hard boiled. Yeah. And I think it's important to know, like, is this a cozy? Is it like everybody's like kind of, I mean, it's not exactly the same as the mysteries, but like, is everybody on the same team and it's about, the party going and like doing something and like probably succeeding at it and probably surviving and whatever? Or is it more of a backstabby, like, is this an HBO show or is it a USA show? Yeah, exactly. Kind of.
Yeah, one
Yeah.
thing we often will cover in that session 0 is like, hey, what are things we just don't want to deal with, you know?
Yeah.
And like I have one player who just like animals being killed is
Yeah,
just
yeah.
not a thing they want to have. Or like another
Mhm.
session, I was in a game shortly after my mother had died,
Mm.
and I was like, could we not have a character who's motivated by like the death of their mother? You know, in
Right,
some way?
yeah.
And they're like, yeah, that's
Yeah.
and
Or like,
and
can we not have like slavery be a huge
yeah,
factor in a setting or something like that?
yeah,
Or
exactly. Can you like tell us that these people are terrible without doing this thing or that thing?
yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, and I agree with you. I totally agree with the railroading thing. Honestly, most of the time when I fudge dice rolls, it's because I realize I've made a mistake
Mm.
where I want this to be a really challenging fight, but I misjudged what level of creature I should have them do, or the
Right.
opposite.
Yeah.
Because you're right, there has to be that balance. And as you said, like for some groups, being stuck there for 6 hours not knowing the puzzle is great.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
for
you have to
others,
know your audience,
yeah,
basically.
and
Yeah.
and for others, like I can easily also see a sign where like one of them's like, all right, it's been half an hour. Can I roll to find traps again?
Right.
And because
Yeah,
they
yeah.
know there's a trap, but they can't find it,
Yeah.
and they roll and it's 1 or 2 off, and you're just like, you found the trap,
Right,
like
right. Yeah.
move this along. So
Yeah.
anyway, so with all that said, let's talk about this book, The Crystal Shard. And
Mhm.
first, let's say I'm not surprised when you talked about this book sort of starting your love of writing, because it is. And I'm using language I think that's often used in negative, and I don't mean it that way. It's not my style of writing, but I think it's very good for what it of that. It's incredibly purple prose. Like no one swings an axe. They swing an axe with the strength of a mighty bull that slices through. And it's just everything is incredibly evocative in this way. And I'm kind of curious, like to what extent was that part of? I feel like this book does a very good job of painting these very emotional,
Mhm.
illustrative ideas of what's happening in every moment. Was that kind of part of what got you into that idea of the writing?
No, and I don't think I agree with your assessment all that much.
Okay, that's fair.
I do think purple prose is very appropriate because the main character's eyes are lavender, and like
I mean,
when
also
it comes to describing specifically, I mean, general physical features, like yeah, there's a high degree of description, I would
yeah.
say.
I should say primarily for the combat specifically is when I was noticing these things happen.
Yeah, I actually think that the combat. So I will say that I think you're right in terms of
Uh-huh.
that was a big thing in terms
Yeah.
of I found that the combat was very well described. I wouldn't really call it purple prose,
Yeah, that's fair.
but it's not flat, you
Yeah.
know. It's to me purple prose implies kind of an overindulgence, in mostly adverbs,
Yeah.
sometimes adjectives. Whereas I think a lot of description of combat and violence is fairly lackluster, and I
Uh-huh.
feel like um, I feel like Salvatore does a great job of it, and it is entertaining to me in a way that
Yeah.
that I think captured my imagination and makes me feel like I can see what's happening. Like,
Yeah.
and that's the big thing to me is I feel like I can see in my mind like where people are, where
Mhm.
how they're situated, what the terrain is like. Yet he does it in a way that I feel doesn't decelerate the pace. Now, if you're less interested in combat,
Mhm.
perhaps it feels like it drags. I don't know. But so yeah, I'd say that you're right that that is one of the things
Right.
that that I really appreciated about these books and in this book, but that I wouldn't necessarily sign on for your exact
Yeah.
description. But I will say, like, this is his first novel,
Yeah.
so it's it's not
He's finding his
it's
voice.
not at the peak of his powers, kind of.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, especially the way you were defining purple prose as kind of overindulgence,
Yeah.
I think by definition, people's bar of what that is going to be different, and that, for me, it
Yeah.
definitely, I think it felt that way, but I can understand why it did not.
Yeah. I mean,
And
it's not Hemingway.
no, no,
Right?
no. It's not that. The very terseness. And I think that one of the things that I really did like, and this is true also of it reminded me a lot of the D&D movie that came out just a couple of years ago with Chris Pine. I want to say Chris Pratt. It's like, no, different Chris. And in that, it's a good reminder that the rules language that Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games have is for the players. It is not for the characters.
Yes.
And, so if what you're looking for is someone to say, well, I can heal you now, but then I'm out of spell slots for the rest of the day, like, that's not what's going to happen.
Right.
No one is, like, you get a good sense of, like, this person is a fighter. One person is specifically a barbarian, which at various points has been both a race and a class in D&D. In this first book, there's no one who's really a magic user among our group of heroes. But there's one person who definitely has more of the skills of a rogue. One person is described as a ranger, but not really in terms of like the class in D&D. And certainly no one's ever talking about like, armor class or hit points or any of this kind of stuff. And I really liked that. I really liked that it's reminding you that the game is meant to simulate these kinds of stories, but that this isn't a story about, exactly like the one-to-one relationship between the rules and the story itself.
Yeah, exactly. Having watched a lot of baseball recently, I'm forced to come up with the comparison of when there's like a hard hit ball that like bounces off someone's glove, and whether it's a hit or an error, that's like a thing that's written down in a box score. It's like a description of what happened. It's like an evaluation. But then the thing that happened is the thing that happened. Right. Like it doesn't actually matter whether it's a hit or an error. The ball did a certain thing and you call it what you do,
Right.
And in, there's the game mechanics, but the game mechanics are there. I mean, it can be as just like a game, like a power game or whatever kind of. The mechanics can be the point if that's kind of what you want, but also they're there to facilitate telling a story and to kind of determine like, well, what happens if two players or two characters are in conflict in a given situation. Right. And, Drizzt is a ranger by class, right? Yeah. But like, that's not like, oh, that's your character class, right? Nobody says that. It's just, that's who he is. That's what he does. That's, right. And all of the characters who are like fighters are like, they're just characters who know how to fight and don't have the skills of the other classes, right. And like a mage is somebody who goes and learns to do magic. And that's why they're a mage, basically. Right. And so, yeah, I totally agree. And that was always one of my pet peeves, playing when characters in dialogue would be discussing game mechanics. And I was like, yeah, and even worse, like in live action, oh, this person has one more point of status. It's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly. Like, and it, how you draw those lines gets different for everyone, but I think just in the world itself, having it be like this, makes so much more sense. Now, let's talk about the character of Drizzt, because I don't know if this was the original intent. My understanding is that these books all being labeled later, The Legend of Drizzt, as I said, it happened later, but he's certainly the main character of this book and of the series. And I know he's someone who you've often mentioned as kind of one of your favorite literary characters, a character you really identify with. Tell us who Drizzt is, and then tell us more about why he means so much to you.
Right. So Drizzt Do'Urden, there's a T at the end. It's not
right.
Just like,
Well, okay, that's funny because I listened to it as a book on tape, and that reader was not pronouncing the T.
Oh yeah, I guess it's kind of hard. And like I don't know if they do it so much here, but in later books they have people mispronouncing his name and like, what's a Drizzt? They don't know it. And but yeah, I'll give the character bio. And I thought about like books on tape, and I was like, oh, I don't think I could listen to these. Like books that like I really already have a connection with and ideas of. It's like listening to them is like, it's weird, And
that also might, just to back up, that also might be why some of the prose felt more purple to me, because it was so.
Oh, for sure.
Sometimes I can flip over that a bit, or just the person reading it, became like, and then he slashed with his axe in a fire that drove his, like that.
Yeah. I mean, I won't go on a lengthy tangent here.
Yeah.
But the spoken language occurs at a slower pace than the written language for most people. I mean, some readers it's not going to be true, right? But like uh, a lot of people can read 200, 300, 400 words a minute, whereas a spoken word, more than 150 words a minute is like the Micro Machines guy, right? Like, or an auctioneer or something, or a horse race caller. So I can definitely see be some of the prose being spoken out loud kind of feeling very different. And personally, like if I were reading a book that I would written, and this is actually just like a quick writer's aside, like often people say like, if you want to improve your writing, read it out loud, because then you'll hear things that just don't sound quite right and you can kind of fix it. So yeah, I that makes a ton of sense for sure. Anyway, Drizzt Do'Urden is a or was, or is, I don't know, it's a fictional character.
Ever shall be.
Yes, is a drow elf from Menzoberranzan, which is a drow elf city, who left, and we won't get into that now too much, but basically was like, this isn't cool. Like, like what we're doing here.
For those who don't know, the drow elf they're from the underground. They're usually very dark skinned, and they're generally because they're from the underground. But if you want to show some racial underpinnings in this, deities acknowledge that and move someone away from it. But the idea is that in this world, they're kind of like goblins or orcs, and that they're almost always evil, and they're always seen as wanting to like attack other people and worshiping often a spider goddess or like some other things like that. They're definitely like, in a world that is pretty clear about who are good guys and bad guys, they are for the most part the bad guys.
Yeah. The drow elves are the, dark-skinned, underground living, and specifically like the Underdark in Forgotten Realms, which is this huge, expansive underground, dungeons essentially, but like it really extended, which, who by game rule are like all chaotic evil. And R.A. Salvatore was like, well, what if they're not? Right? Like, what if one of them isn't? And they're like generally like very brilliant and this and that. And I think they've kind of, in newer editions, they've kind of retconned them to where they're kind of more like grayish or like not, which I don't know. We don't have to get into that. But obviously, there is something inherently problematic with being like, okay, the dark-skinned elves are going to be the bad ones.
Yeah.
Interestingly, like the dwarves, the evil dwarves are like gray dwarves.
Yeah.
And then but whatever. The point being like that there are like the goodly races and the evil races and whatever. But like amongst the like goodly races, like humans are of all, alignments and whatever,
Right.
And the way I like to see it is that like the cultures of, the drow that are like prominent are like very evil cultures. And I think, there's a book, Homeland, which is a prequel, that's gets into that culture. And I think it's fine for like a culture to be evil because I kind of think most are, but and the thing about Drizzt that I always related to was that like he grew up in a very evil world and rejected it and was like, no, I'm not going to just go around randomly killing people because like that's what I'm supposed to do,
Right.
And also his best friend's a cat. He's got a panther that's like in this figurine and whatever, blah, blah, blah. Guinevere, not Guinevere. Like, sounds like something else. And, basically he chose to, exile himself and leave the place he grew up and try to find a culture that kind of, well, he didn't actually start off like trying to, okay, I'm not going to tell his whole backstory, but the point is he became a ranger, and loves living in the wilderness and then has like this small group of very close friends. Right. And, and a lot of that is because racism, and in the Forgotten Realms, it's more understandable in a way because
Right.
like the Drow elf culture is like, it puts America to shame. Like,
Pretty bad.
it's like it's a fantasy chaotic evil culture, which would be interesting to discuss at some point. But
Mm.
it throughout the books, I think we see that like the human cultures aren't great, you
Yeah.
know. And in this book, in the Crystal Shard, there's the 10 towns, and they're all primarily human towns. And then there's the barbarians, who class or race or whatever. It's another group of humans who also seem to not like really have a great culture, right?
Right.
Like it's very chauvinistic, it's all about fighting and raiding and whatever, but also you can kind of see where it came from because they're surviving in this brutal wilderness,
Yeah.
and then the dwarves are kind of put forth as kind of being the maybe the good culture with like the good king and whatever. Were there any female dwarves?
No.
I don't remember any female dwarves.
Look, we're not going to spend too much time going into it because I think there's nothing about this book that is particularly bad for its time. It's just a book of its time, and so it is.
That's not even what I meant. I
No,
meant,
no. I know.
I
Just
know.
tangenting off of it. Like,
sure.
there's like one or two female characters who exist mostly to be love interests or to be rescued. And it's probably going to change, I think, more in the later books.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, there are no female dwarves, and there's not really many.
Many
there's
female humans, and
there's a beautiful girl who the dwarf has adopted and is now kind of a love interest for the barbarian king.
Right. And yeah, and so originally the books were conceived as like Wolfgar was going to be the main character, just like kind of Conan the Barbarian type character.
Yeah.
And
Wolfgar is he's a barbarian, but on a raid. Most of his band was killed. He was like a young teenager. And so basically a dwarf adopted him and kind of civilized him and taught him like, how to be better and stuff like that.
And made him a Mjolnir, basically. And
Aegis Fang, the super badass hammer that comes back to his hand.
Exactly. And then he, his adopted sister, kind of they're the love interest, which is
right.
Its own thing. But yeah, so like he was gonna be the main character apparently. But I think writing the book, just like Salvatore just realized like Drizzt is the interesting one.
Yeah.
It's like he was supposed to be this, kind of interesting sidekick. And I was like, no, that's the more interesting character, and he's got these like, I don't know, journal entries / monologues between each part, right? There's usually like 3 or 4 parts to each book. And this was actually the main reason I thought it would be interesting to talk about, is because like clearly he's a character who had kind of an ethos that wasn't external,
right?
Like he had an idea of like what he thought was like a reasonable way to act, saw that around him nobody was doing that and was like, well, whatever, I'm still going to do that in the best way that I can. Ultimately pretty much had to leave his homeland in order to continue doing that and not become dead, and then found a bunch of other cultures that like also that wasn't the easiest, and that's how he kind of ends up on the edges of civilization, living somewhere where there's like a few people who really accept him as who he is, and then a lot of people who are very suspicious of him, but he basically is constantly pondering kind of like, what's the best way to go about this? Like what's going on in terms of like, what people want, and like kind of like, just like basically he's having his own little mini superhero ethics episode before each part of, of each book.
And it's interesting, I think if there's any kind of overall theme that I'm finding, especially in this book, but I think it's going to be true for a lot of the others, it's really about the individual over the group. And it's I actually made a comment to Paul as we were talking, as I was reading this, of like, okay, the many times you and I have argued over how much does it matter that like a person is part of, a group versus like them as the individual. I should have just read this book.
Hmm.
And I couldn't
Yeah.
say, Paul, you should just have had me read this book, because you have been recommending that I read it for more than
I
20 years.
might have mentioned it a few times.
Once or twice. And it's interesting that in some ways the Wolfgar story and the Driz story are both kind of parallel. And
Yeah.
there's problematic natures in both. In the Wolfgar story is the, barbarian, the wild person, uncivilized, is raised by the more civilized community and then turns out to be a lot better and goes back and rules the barbarian community.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff you can see in there, but I think it's more a product of its time than it is like anything specific that Salvatore is trying to say. But in both, it's about what happens when an individual is not like the group. And as you said, kind of like, yes, there is some justification for the bias against the group in this world in a way that's not true about our own world with a lot of the biases people have. But it still raises that question of, okay, but what happens when you're not meeting the Drow? You're meeting Driz. When you're not meeting a barbarian, you're meeting Wolfgar.
Right.
And how do people get past those things? And how do, what is, that a lot of the things that's talked about is how important it is for Driz that he has this group of friends who all see him not as a Drow, but as the individual Driz Do'Urden.
Yeah. And I think the most important thing is that he sees himself as who he is.
Yeah.
I think that's primary. But then I think the fact that there are a select few people who also see him for that and accept him as who he is, as opposed to seeing him as a representative of a group that, like, he's not a member, he's like shares genetic material,
Right.
but like he's not culturally a Drow elf. Like he grew up in a Drow elf city and then he rejected the culture and adopted his own, right? And so I think having that small number of people who see him for him, I think it makes it so that having all the other people who don't see him as him, who just see him as a Drow elf, right? I think, like, not that he doesn't care at all, but like it takes the sting out of that kind of, I think.
Yeah.
Where it's like, the fact that there's some people who like get him, basically. I think it's like, well, that's enough, for him. Like, it would be nice if everybody did. And spoilers, maybe there are some developments along this whole thing, 30 some books in or whatever, right? But like in the short, the fact that he can have a few really good friends who don't share the same exact experience, but like, yeah, Wolfgar grew up in a certain, he was taken from his culture. Otherwise he would have been murdered like the other fallen barbarians who were just like stabbed to death after having tried to raid the 10 towns. But he, he then grew up in this dwarf home, and he's not a dwarf, right? But he's not culturally a barbarian the same way anymore. He's and ultimately he chooses what he wants to do, and he says, okay, I am going to go back. I'm going to take some of what I learned, but I'm also going to take kind of, he ultimately makes his own decision, right? Nobody else tells him, oh, you should go do this. Go back to the barbarians or whatever. He decides what he's going to do. And so I think that having, the kind of story of like growing up somewhere that isn't necessarily the best, and then having agency in, being able to decide, okay, I'm going to be who I want to be.
Yeah.
And then having some friends who see that and are like, cool, we like who you want to be.
Yeah.
Let's
talk for a bit about the villain of this story. And there's a couple, and there's a lot of the villain is prejudice, and a lot of the villain is, because in these part of the story is that there's 10 towns in Icewind Dale. It's all up in the frozen north. And then also there's the barbarians and
the dwarves.
The dwarves. Yeah. And that there's external threats. And at first it's that can all the 10 towns and the dwarves unite against the barbarians. And then later it's can they and the barbarians unite against the larger threat. And the larger threat is this wizard named Akar Kessel. And I think I'm getting the first name right. It's definitely Kessel.
Yeah.
And he has come across this thing called a crystal shard. And there's a whole other thing we can get into with that, but it's basically this like element of power created by demons and having all sorts of like evil McEvil thing. It's kind of the One Ring, it's that kind of like whoever shall possess it has a lot of power. And
can I say what it is?
Sure.
Yeah, Crunchinaban is a sounds like a Cinnabon.
Yeah, very so.
But I think it was created by liches, actually.
Okay,
a bunch of undead mages that then it ended up consuming them, I think, and then it's very much, you're right. It's like the One Ring, but it's this evil artifact, but it's a sentient. I would say it's the primary villain.
Yeah.
Of and then there's also a demon who's after it, who's another villain, and
right.
It's this artifact of great evil that is sentient, and Akar Kessel is, you could say, the primary antagonist.
Yeah, that's right.
And he's a stooge for the crystal shard. Like, he basically, some other wizards were like, hey, stab your wizard mentor, and then they stabbed him and left him to die or whatever, and then maybe they didn't stab him, but like they just left him to die, and then he found the crystal shard, and then he becomes a great and powerful Oz. Wait, no.
Well, and that's kind of my point. That's why, to me, he's a really interesting villain, is because he's kind of just a nobody. That's part of the point. Is he's the wizarding community is presented as kind of like not great people to begin with.
Awful.
But that they have these very strict rules of apprenticeship and stuff like that. And apparently that there's one wizard who's kind of getting in the way of the other wizards. They don't like him very much. And they basically just straight up manipulate his apprentice and tell his apprentice, like, if you kill your mentor, we will make you, we'll let you sit at the cool kids table.
Yeah.
Like, it's 100% like this kind of bullying of, we're going to take the fact that you're weak and mild-mannered, but that you don't have a heart of gold, because it's not that every person who gets bullied turns out to be the nicest person in the world. Many do. And bullying does not make people bad. But sometimes bullying leaves you in a position where if you have the chance to be the bully, you're going to take it. And he gets that chance. He kills his mentor. And then immediately they leave him. They abandon him. And as you said, he finds the crystal shard, and it's now 100%. Okay, now I have the power. Now I'm going to get all of the things I can do. And it's he's definitely evil McEvil pants. He finds like the local women to bring to him and unites all these groups. And I just thought it was a very interesting perspective of a villain, that it's not that he's been power mad all of his life. It's that he kind of just wanted to fit in. And when he got rejected, he was like, well, fine, I'll just I will build the table, and I'll force everyone to come to my table if they won't let me sit at their table.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I was going to say he's kind of a loser, which isn't necessarily not true, but like, I think you were more spot on with, like, he's kind of a nobody. He's just like a nothing. He's this not very good apprentice wizard, who's like probably not going to make it as a wizard, and so he does get manipulated very easily / bullied, and then he stumbles onto power. And to me, it's not the like power corrupts story per se. It's more the, like, I would say it's more power reveals, where it's like, that's, he didn't have any kind of like clear idea of like what he thought was right or a good thing to do or whatever. He just was kind of doing right. Like, and he was kind of just going along because maybe what else was he going to do? And then he all of a sudden gets a lot of power, and he's like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to use it for, basically, whatever I can think of that I enjoy. And he's not some great strategist militarily. And I think there's things where like the shard is like frustrated with kind of how dopey he is, how dopey, right? And like he's not really following the plan as well as it should be, and then Heir 2, the demon, like shows up, and like he wants the crystal shard, but this other guy's got it, and he's like, I gotta just kind of like hang out here until he screws it up, and then I'll get it. And
it's a very interesting perspective in that regard. And I think the power reveals is really the best statement, because it's the like, it's not that the biggest, strongest people at school are always going to be bullies. Sometimes they're going to be wonderful people. And it's not that the smallest, menchiest people are always going to be like wonderful victims with hearts of gold.
Right.
Sometimes a person is, tiny and can't hurt anyone, but would happily be a bully. They just don't have any ability to. And
Right,
then all of a
exactly.
sudden you make them into like, 7 foot tall, 200 pounds. Actually, that sounds really unhealthy, but you know what I mean? Like, they become like strong enough to push
Yeah.
people around on the middle school playground. Sometimes they're going to.
Right, yeah. Wolfgar's 7 feet tall, but I think he's a little more than 200 pounds.
Yeah, probably more
Yeah.
like closer to that
Yeah.
300 number.
Yeah.
The description of his muscles are many. They are many, many.
It's corded. Yeah. No, I see what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
And I think it's because it was book on tape.
for sure.
That probably hit me.
Yeah.
One thing that I thought was interesting, and again, this is not I don't mean this to attack the book, but I think it's just an interesting sign of like how things have changed. At least I hope, although some people are fighting against this to be sure, but I'm curious your perspective. One of the ideas in the book is that there is this relationship between the main dwarf, Brunar, and Wolfgar, who is his kind of his adopted son. And they make a big deal about how Wolfgar is getting ready to go out on his own, and dwarves are miners and smiths, and that one thing, and that this is the closest thing to kind of like a D&D rule that is in the book, but I get it. They make it work for the story. Is that every dwarf kind of has the ability to make like the one best thing, like their magnum opus. But it's not an opera. It's going to be like a weapon or a sheet of armor or something else that they've forged. And when they do it, they'll never do it again. And what he does is to make, as you described it, Mjolnir. It's called Aegis Fang. It's this incredible axe or hammer that is, can knock down 3 orcs at a time. It will always fly back to his hand and is just, +5 everything. And the book makes a big deal about how it was so essential for him to do this because, of course, as a manly warrior of the dwarves, he could never tell Wolfgar how he feels about him. And he knew Wolfgar would never say the same either, but that this was the way that they would express it to each other. And again, this is just how people thought about these things at the time. And how still some folks think about it. But I did have I was reading it. I was just like, it's okay to tell your son you love them. Really, it is. I promise. Like so much of that I found very frustrating because I just see that idea as being so damaging. And granted, that's probably me projecting a lot of stuff in my own relationship with my father. That's been problematic. I've talked about at length. But it definitely, I think there's been a real cultural shift recently of like men talking about their emotions with other men is not unmanly. And I don't think this book is particularly bad in that regard compared to anything else from this time. But it's definitely written at a time when that was not how men are supposed to express their feelings to their sons.
Yeah, I mean, I agree and I disagree. Like, I think that's those two characters, and I don't think those two characters should be written differently now. You know what I mean? Like, the cultures are what the cultures are, and the characters are who the characters are, and I don't think there's anything wrong with having characters like that. Like, I think you can convey the same thing with the author maybe trying to kind of angle for like, here's potentially some of the downsides of this or whatever.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know. So first of all, it's interesting because I grew up with the opposite, right? Like every night I would go to bed and, my dad would like help me go to sleep. He'd like tell me a story or whatever and this or that. And like, he'd say like, we love you just because you're you. Like he would just say that like every night, except when like he was away, like shooting on location or something. Right. But like, so I definitely, and then also, I grew up in this like surrounded by a very kind of like hippie, like almost in this like village in Manhattan, the Manhattan Plaza. And like, and a lot of my teachers were women, and it was just this. There was I didn't grow up in that culture that I am aware is like the predominant culture in the United States, especially in that time that we grew up, right? So I've always seen that as like something that's talked about, but not something that I experienced in the same way, right? So I can't speak to the experience of growing up in that. But I can say that obviously not everybody grew up that way at this time, right? And I would say still, I believe that there are a lot of people still growing up the way you're talking about, with this idea like men are men and blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah, you know? I do think the kind of over culture or whatever has shifted to where, you know, men and boys and whatever, like expressing emotions is more generally culturally acceptable.
Yeah.
Although it's a shift, but there's also a backlash and this and that.
Yep.
And but I'll also say that I don't think there's anything entirely inherently culturally wrong with not always communicating love and affection verbally.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's value in doing it. I like to do it. To an extent, right?
Yeah.
But also I kind of speak the language of expressing that in other ways, both from like growing up in like in Taekwondo. Like, I know what my teacher thought of me, even though he didn't say certain things certain ways, you know. And more specifically, I would say like, especially, I think it's a particularly common thing, especially in East Asian cultures, but it's not just like this culture or that culture, but I'm just talking about that because that's my experience where, you know, my wife's Chinese American, but and you know, her dad said 2 words to me, like literally, like I knew him for almost 20 years, right? Like 15 years or so, but before he died. And the only time I remember him like saying words to me, as opposed to like, you know, like kind of a grunt and a wave or whatever, acknowledging my presence in a mildly positive way, was like, I drove him to the casino and it was just him. Usually I drive both my wife's parents to the casino, but I drove just him one time. And he just said, thank you, you know? And it's like that. It hits differently when those are like the only words someone says. And then also like he would make dumplings for me. And he made like an absurd amount of dumplings, like vegetarian, vegan dumplings. And my wife's mom also, when she wasn't well and we were staying with her and helping her with her medical stuff, but like also we were staying there, and every morning she would like at like 5 a.m, she'd like make like juke, like porridge and dumplings. And like in some cultures, like that's how you say I love you. And I think that's okay.
Yes.
You know, but I think it's important that both people speak that language and understand that that's what it means, you know? And so I know there's like books about like love languages and whatever, blah, 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 blah. But like, again, I just want to say, like, I think verbal communication is valuable. It has value. I appreciate having grown up never feeling like I shouldn't express my emotions. Like that was never a thing that I had put upon me. And I appreciate that. And I think it sucks that there is this like, no, you shouldn't do that, this kind of shaming. But also, I think the ability to communicate non-verbally has a lot of value. And I think recognizing that that's kind of the way some cultures are more apt to do things is also important.
100%. I want to clarify 2 things. One is that you said towards the beginning of that like maybe the writer could have angled a bit. And I think that's what I'm talking about. I think you were right.
Yeah.
It would change these characters if they did do that. Like,
right.
Like, and I have nothing wrong with characters who have that perspective, and also totally agree that there are, you know, these things are emphasized more or less in different cultures. I'm also autistic, and so like it is harder for my brain to believe nonverbal things.
Sure.
And I get that, and that's not true of everyone. To me, it was, and I wish I had screenshotted it so I could have the exact words in front of me, but the way it was written wasn't I think in part because the Driz stuff is first person, but everyone else is third person. That it really felt like it wasn't the author saying, from Bruner's perspective, here's how it all was. But it was the author saying, isn't Bruner a great example of malehood? Because of course he shouldn't say this, but here's how he does it. Sure. And I agree that if you have the ability to do only one great thing and you do it for this person who is supposed to be your enemy, but you've adopted and made your son, that is an incredible statement of love. That, I don't need you to like attach a card saying I love you to it. By any means. For me, it was more just that it felt to me like the author was saying,
Okay.
not even like the author was saying like soy boy is just some nonsense like that. Just that the author was saying, like most people believed at that time, like,
Yeah, sure.
well, yeah, because guys aren't supposed to like say how they feel, but here's how they do it instead.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, and again, I think this might be another spot where reading and listening might be a different experience.
Yeah.
Just in terms of when I'm reading it, I'm hearing it in my voice, and
Yeah.
so I can sometimes put my own spin on something, whereas when you're listening, you're hearing it in the reader's voice, and they might be putting their own spin on it, and it's certainly harder for you to kind of,
Yeah.
But yeah, also I have reread this. When was it? It was about 2 years ago when it was very snowing here. It felt like the
Yeah.
perfect time. And then this year when it started to snow, I started again, and I was like, I got a lot of stuff to do.
Yeah, that's fair.
But I'll probably reread Streams of Silver before we go over that one if we do.
Yeah. Last thing I want to talk about, because we're just about an hour already, and I don't want this to go in for too long, but is the halfling character, Regis, who in many ways was my favorite in book 1. And in book 2, I'm like, you're going places I don't think I'm okay with, but we'll see where that goes. He has a gem. He has a pendant that basically is some kind of magical item of convincing. And basically, like, he's able to enchant people to think what he wants them to think, to listen to him and be convinced by him. And in the second book, he starts doing some real shady stuff with it. We'll get to that. But in this book, more than anything, he's the person who understands that the people need to unite together and need to all like put aside their petty differences. Although some of the differences are pretty significant. But still, it's like, you're fighting over fishing boats when someone's coming to burn all your towns.
Yeah.
And so he uses this magical ability to get people to do what I think we as the readers are clearly feeling like is the right thing. But of course, towards the end of the book, they start to figure out that he's doing this, and he starts to lose some credibility. What's kind of your take on his story?
I think you can go back and listen to our episode on the end of Supergirl season 1, I believe, and it's pretty much.
How do you feel about brainwashing people to make them do the right thing?
Exactly. I don't remember whether he also does some things to kind of get like some extra. I think he does kind of get some cushy whatever stuff going on somewhere along the way, right?
He is a rogue, and in D&D, there's always been this sort of like, thieving is kind of okay if you're part of a guild,
Right. As long as you're part of a guild, well, we'll circle back to that. And yeah, I mean, I'm fine with convincing people. Like, to me, it depends on like what. Okay, if it's like you're gonna use mind control to convince something that you think is in someone's best interest, but like that's kind of a subjective thing. I'm like not
maybe if they're selling some sort of
death sticks or whatever. I'll co-sign that one. I don't care. Like that one doesn't bother me that much. I mean, it is an interesting example, especially when we have the whole Siths are the only one who deal in absolutes, and wait a minute. But yeah, I mean, like, oh, you shouldn't wear purple. Like, what? Or like, this or that. Like, there's plenty of things that I would deeply object to. But when it comes to like convincing people to like not sit around and bicker and instead to like not sit around and bicker and get murdered and have everybody else around them get murdered, like, yeah, that it seems okay. It's one of those like, it's always for me, it's just going to be, okay, well, what are the positives and the negatives, right? Like, okay, overriding someone's agency. Yeah, that default to bad. I would default to like not a fan, but it's like, if it's not just to get them to like, if somebody's about to walk off a cliff by accident and you're just like, turn around, I'm fine with that. And this is like that mostly. if you went around like mind controlling like individual people to get them to fight to defend the towns instead of when they wanted to run away or something, I'd be like, oh no,
Yeah, that's not cool.
that's not cool.
And I think what I like most about the book, and clearly I think the books are going to further explore the ethical questions around the gem used by the halfling, because the third book is called The Halfling's Gem.
It might come up again. It might come up again.
But I think what I like most about how it's handled in this book is that it's the ethics of it aren't even really discussed as much as the consequences.
Right,
Because
yeah.
one of the things that happens is he
Yeah.
gets caught.
Right.
And that later, because of that, when he does have all of his warnings were accurate,
Yeah.
but especially later when he has an even more genuine, like, no, I'm absolutely right here, you have to believe me.
Yeah.
They literally don't believe him.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, like, yes, everything is always going to tie back to our own world and stuff like that. You know, we live in a world where a lot of people are trying really hard to convince people of things that we just know are true that they're not believing. And people are trying different things, and sometimes those are like, let's just in the driest way lay out all the facts. That's not very effective. But also sometimes people are doing not mind control, but are maybe like fudging the facts a little bit, or are, you know, kind of using incredibly emotional appeals. And we're seeing some of like, okay, well, what happens when you do that too much, you know? And, I'm really interested to see where that goes, because I think there's very good conversations to be had about when you need to convince people of something and they're not believing it, or their ignorance is going to not only harm them, but harm you and harm everyone. What is and isn't okay, both ethically and strategically, about how to convince them. And those are two related but separate questions.
Yeah, I agree. I think the strategic question is at least as interesting. It's maybe just as consequential or more consequential. But like, yeah, that whole, you know, there was a time a few years ago when some big thing happened and somebody put out this fact or told me, you know, some number, and in order to talk about how horrible something someone had done, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, that doesn't sound right. That's got to be off, right? It was about the whole like going to space, but like not really space, but like the amount of the carbon footprint and the amount of energy and whatever, and that had done the same amount as like the entire half population of the world.
Yeah,
and the implication was combined. Like, I was like, really? I was like, that's insane. That's terrible. I was like, but that doesn't sound right. And I looked it up. It was like, no, it was of the average person from the bottom half. So instead of 4 billion, it was off by a factor of 4 billion.
That's a really significant number.
And when I confronted them, I was like, you know, this actually, like, it's bad still, but it's like, you're off by a factor of 4 billion. And they're like, oh yeah, well, I'm not going to correct myself when it comes to criticisms of people that I think are like this bad. And I'm like, but I can't trust anything you say anymore. Like, you understand? Like, your entire credibility is just shot because, number one, you were wrong. That's okay. You can be wrong. But two, when you are like willfully, I let the wrong statement stand, we're done. Like, we're just done. And so that's why when you were saying, you know, like, okay, if you want to do an extremely emotional appeal, emotionally manipulative, whatever, if that's what's going to get somebody to like see reality, I don't have a big problem with that. But if you're going to actually lie in order to get people to see the truth, where are we going here? You know, and like now you're maybe even going to get them to double down. Oh, see, they were lying. Now they can prove that you were lying. Why on earth are they going to believe the first thing you were trying to convince them of? So, you know, in this situation with Regis, it's like, okay, it is literally like an existential threat, right? That they're trying to overcome. So it's like, well, you got to win the first battle. You can't worry about the second battle yet, right? But like when it comes to things like convincing people of like scientific reality, I think you can lose people, and then that can spiral because then they're going to spread that to other people, and I think you can have some real big problems there.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I think we do. And,
we do.
Yeah, and so I think that's a great thing for us.
And that's why we read fantasy books. Not really, but you know,
it's some escapism is helpful. All right, well, this has been fantastic, Paul. Thanks so much for recommending this book to me.
Thank you for reading it.
Man, my pleasure. I'm gonna keep reading them. Yes, I do think listening to a book on tape is reading. I'm not gonna get into any of that nonsense. The author had words in their head that they put into a medium, and now those words are in my head. So that's words have been transferred from one head to another.
Yeah.
But we're gonna read the other books. We're not gonna do that next week. We have a lot of other great things coming out, but it'll be one more thing to come out soon. Of course, on our Star Wars podcast recently, we've been talking about Maul. We've been talking about Mandalorian and Grogu. I'm not sure when this episode is going to come out, but either shortly before or after this episode, we will have things on the new He-Man movie, as well as the mining the nostalgia of late Gen X, early millennials for content, and probably something about the boys and some other great stuff. So please check all that out. Paul, of course, you can find their writings on zmanman.com. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing over there.
Yeah, so I've got a poker newsletter called Friday Night is My Monday Morning. You can sign up and have it in your inbox every Friday, or you can just go to my website and read it. It's about poker, but I often make analogies and metaphors, connections to various other topics, like fairly varied, I'd say.
Yeah.
And also I'm going to have a page with links to my fiction, and maybe you'll even be able to get some of it right there on zenmadman.com.
Yeah, definitely check it out. I'm enjoying those. I'm a poker player, so I enjoy the poker side, but also there's a lot of just stuff about like how do you deal with losing, and how do you make a plan, and how do you start a plan, and beginning at the beginning and stuff like that. So please check all that out. Please check out all the great things on ethicalpanda.com. And most importantly, may the force be with you.
Oh, I had something I wanted to. This would have been funnier if I did it. May the fleas of 1,000 reindeer nest in your genitals.
Yes, that is a quote from the book.
That's a quote from the book.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Peace.
Peace.